Rephrased, same style, new wording. Singapore transformed from a tiny, resourceless island into one of the richest nations on Earth in just 5 decades. Today, the average Singaporean is wealthier than the average American. But back in 1965, almost everyone believed Singapore was finished. They had just been expelled from Malaysia. No oil, no minerals, smaller than New York City. Unemployment was sky-high, hostile neighbors on all sides, and not even a real army. The leadership gathered. Gentlemen, one crisis at a time. Which problem do we solve first? The answer? All of them, at the same time. That's impossible. And yet, that's exactly what they did. But before we get to the comeback, we need to rewind. For centuries, Singapore was nothing more than a quiet fishing village. No global importance, no destiny. Until 1819, when a British official named Stamford Raffles arrived and saw something everyone else missed. This swampy island, he said? Perfect. Mosquitoes, pirates, jungle, even better. Why? Location. Right between India and China, sitting at the choke point between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Every major trade route passed right through it. Owning Singapore was like owning a toll booth on the busiest highway on Earth. Raffles was right. Under British rule, Singapore exploded. Immigrants from China, India, and the Malay world poured in. The population skyrocketed, the port boomed, trade flourished. Singapore became one of Britain's most valuable assets in Asia, making fortunes, mostly for the British. Then came World War II. Sir, the Japanese are invading. Relax, Singapore is an impenetrable fortress. Massive naval guns pointed at the sea, armor-piercing shells ready to tear enemy battleships apart. Then the message arrived. They're attacking from the north, through the jungle. Impossible. Everyone knew armies couldn't move through jungle. They could, and they did. In February 1942, Japan captured Singapore in what Winston Churchill later called the worst military disaster in British history. Britain had defended the wrong direction and paid for it with total defeat. The occupation was brutal. Tens of thousands died, food vanished, life collapsed. The Japanese renamed the city Light of the South, though there was nothing light about those years. When the war ended in 1945, the British returned, but their authority was gone. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. Independence, the locals demanded. You can't run a country yourselves. We survived 3 years without you. We'll manage. But independence came with a twist. Singapore was small, majority Chinese, and surrounded by Malay-dominated Malaya. The British had an idea: merge them all into one country. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia. On paper, it made sense. Singapore brought economic expertise, Malaysia brought land and resources. In reality, disaster. Ethnic tensions exploded, economic policies clashed, riots broke out, people died. 2 years later, Malaysia made a decision no one expected. They expelled Singapore. On August 9, 1965, Singapore became independent, not by choice, but by force. And on live television, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew cried, not tears of joy, tears of fear, because Singapore looked doomed. No resources, no water, no army, no safety net, surrounded by larger suspicious neighbors, an economy dependent on British military bases that were about to leave. Lee Kuan Yew summed it up simply: we are going to die. Then he corrected himself. No, we're not. Singapore had one advantage left: location. Ships were still passing through, trade was still flowing. If Singapore could become the financial and commercial heart of Southeast Asia, survival was possible. But first, everything had to change. Water? Build reservoirs everywhere, collect rain from rooftops, develop desalination, even if the technology didn't exist yet. Economy? Instead of protectionism, Singapore went fully open. Zero tolerance for corruption, rule of law, low taxes, efficient government. Foreign companies weren't pushed away, they were invited. Housing? Slums were erased. The government built massive public housing, not to give away, but to sell affordably. Forced savings through the Central Provident Fund turned citizens into homeowners, investors, and stakeholders in the nation. Education? If there were no natural resources, people would be the resource. Schools multiplied. English became the common language, neutral, global, and powerful. Every child learned English plus their mother tongue. Defense? Every male citizen served. Singapore became small, but deadly, a country too costly to invade. And it worked. Factories arrived, banks followed, trade exploded, growth surged. Within a generation, Singapore went from first world to first. By the 1990s, Singapore's GDP per capita surpassed Britain, the same empire that once ruled it. Clean streets, low crime, world-class port, elite airport, one of Asia's strongest economies. Lee Kuan Yew ruled tightly. Critics called it authoritarian. Lee called it practical. You can have freedom in a failing country, or order in a successful one. In 2015, Lee Kuan Yew died at 91. The nation mourned for days. Whatever people thought of his methods, no one could deny the outcome. A country that wasn't supposed to exist thrived. Singapore proved something the world thought impossible. When there is no backup plan, when failure means extinction, you either succeed or you disappear. Singapore chose to succeed. Singapore's story is not a miracle. It's something far more uncomfortable than that. Because miracles suggest luck. Singapore was built on fear, discipline, and relentless realism. In 1965, this country was not underdeveloped, it was unfinished. A city without resources, without land, without water, without an army, and without friends. Independence wasn't celebrated with fireworks, it arrived with tears on live television. Lee Kuan Yew wasn't crying for effect, he was mourning what he believed was an inevitable failure. Most nations fail quietly. Singapore failed loudly, in front of the entire world, and survived anyway. What made Singapore different wasn't ideology. It wasn't democracy versus authoritarianism, capitalism versus socialism, East versus West. Singapore succeeded because it asked the only question that actually matters when survival is on the line. What works? When water was a threat, they engineered water. When jobs were a threat, they invited the world in. When division was a threat, they forced unity. When weakness was a threat, they built deterrence. Every policy was judged not by how it sounded, but by whether it kept the country alive. And that's the part most people miss. Singapore didn't chase perfection, it chased stability. And once stability was secured, everything else followed. Growth, prosperity, security, confidence. There were no romantic ideals about national identity in the early years, no poetic speeches about destiny, just cold calculations. How do we eat? How do we work? How do we defend ourselves? How do we stop killing each other? Lee Kuan Yew understood something many leaders don't. You cannot debate philosophy when the house is on fire. So he made choices others were afraid to make. He crushed corruption without compromise. He punished disorder without apology. He prioritized competence over popularity. He delayed freedom in exchange for survival. To the West, this looked authoritarian. To Singapore, it looked like a lifeline. And the results speak louder than ideology ever could. Within a single generation, slums disappeared, literacy skyrocketed, crime collapsed, the economy exploded. A nation with no natural resources became a global financial nerve center. A nation with no natural resources became one of the wealthiest societies on Earth. Singapore didn't just catch up to the developed world, it leapfrogged it. But this success came at a price. Strict laws, limited political opposition, controlled media, social pressure to conform. Singapore made a trade-off most countries only debate in theory. Order over chaos, collective discipline over individual expression, results over rhetoric. Was it worth it? That question still divides people today. Critics argue that prosperity without freedom is incomplete, that wealth cannot replace voice, that long-term innovation requires dissent, and they may be right. Supporters argue that freedom is meaningless without safety, that chaos destroys opportunity, that a poor democracy feeds no one, and they may be right too. Singapore forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. There is no universal formula for success. What works for a fragile city-state surrounded by rivals may not work for a massive, diverse superpower. What saved Singapore in the 1960s might fail elsewhere, or even fail in Singapore itself one day. Because success creates new problems. Today, Singapore faces challenges Lee Kuan Yew never fully had to solve. An aging population, declining birth rates, rising inequality, expensive housing, and a younger generation that grew up with prosperity, not fear. The discipline that once united the country now competes with global culture, social media, and new expectations of personal freedom. The question is no longer how do we survive, but how do we evolve without losing what made us strong? That's a much harder question. Yet, regardless of what the future holds, Singapore's rise has already secured its place in history. It proved that geography can be leveraged, not suffered, that human capital can replace natural resources, that small nations are not destined to be irrelevant, that discipline, when applied intelligently, can outperform chaos. Most importantly, Singapore proves that failure is not fatal, denial is. They didn't pretend they were strong. They didn't pretend they were rich. They didn't pretend they were safe. They accepted reality as it was, brutal, unfair, and unforgiving, and built a system designed for that reality, not an imagined one. And that might be the most important lesson of all. Because when people say something is impossible, what they usually mean is, I don't want to make the sacrifices required. Singapore made those sacrifices. It sacrificed comfort for discipline, ideology for pragmatism, short-term popularity for long-term survival. And in return, it earned something rare in history, control over its own destiny. A tiny island that was never meant to exist as a nation became a global benchmark for governance, efficiency, and economic success. Not because it was lucky, not because it was chosen, but because it refused to accept extinction as an option. Singapore had no choice: succeed or disappear. And when survival is the only goal, impossible becomes irrelevant. So the next time you hear someone say a country is too small, too poor, too divided, too broken to succeed, remember Singapore. Remember that a nation with no water, no army, and no resources outperformed empires. Because history doesn't reward potential, it rewards execution. And Singapore executed flawlessly.